Hello, my name is Shane Healy and I'm here with Sister Angela Reid today. And Sister Angela is part of the Mercy Nuns and the Mercy International. 46 countries the Mercy's represented in. And we're going to meet Sister Angela because she's about to take on a really fascinating role. Welcome to you, Sister Angela.
Yeah.
It's lovely to meet you. Brendan Reid's sister. For those who know Father Brendan Reid in Deepdean and Balwyn, you'll immediately pick quite a likeness. We might talk a bit more about Brendan later, if that's all right. Tell us about your background. You're about to take on a fascinating role at the United Nations,
Right.
but let's explore a little bit about what you have done.
Okay. Well, I joined the Sisters of Mercy over 20 years ago, and during that time I've been a primary school teacher. I trained in Catholic primary education before I joined the Sisters of Mercy, and then I taught for some years at Holy Rosary in Kensington and St Margaret's in Maribyrnong. So I guess inner city schools, multicultural schools, got to know different families through that, and then I moved into some theological studies, and while I was doing that I worked in the area of homelessness. We had a refuge, and we still have that in a different setting now, but we had a women's refuge for homeless women called Regina Charlie,
I see.
which is now part of Macaulay Community Services
Yes.
for Women.
Yes.
So I lived there and worked there, and then I moved in a similar working with women who were experiencing family violence.
Right.
And I coordinated that service for about 7 years here in Melbourne, which then led me to my work on trafficking. So during my time at the refuge, I met women who had been trafficked.
So give us an example of that.
So in the actual refuge, it was a family violence refuge. I met a woman who said that she'd been invited to come to Australia to be married. When she arrived, her so-called spouse-to-be was already married and was really engaging her in prostitution, and he was taking the profits from that. She was gaining nothing, and she was pretty much a prisoner in the back of his house. So
she ended up with the Sisters of Mercy in the
she
end.
ended up, she sought help through at that time, the Women's Domestic Violence Crisis Service, and came to the Sisters of Mercy and sought refuge with us. So that was just one example. There were definitely other scenarios, but it raised my consciousness about human trafficking, and it also I started to wonder whether there was the same stereotypes that were present in the domestic violence sector as there was in the trafficking. In other words, women who were experiencing family violence weren't necessarily coming with black eyes and broken bones.
Yes.
And so you wouldn't necessarily identify them as women who had been victims of family violence. Likewise, trafficked women certainly weren't, in chains. But they were definitely trapped and in
Psychologically
some kind of bondage.
trapped.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And so did your research show you that the two did have some
Absolutely.
crossover?
Yeah, I'm glad to say that my hunch was, in fact, it taught me that there are less overt ways of being trafficked, and there are less overt ways in which family violence happens.
Yes.
My research, I went to live in the Philippines because I wanted to, we talk about source countries, and the Philippines is considered a source country in terms of trafficking.
Right.
And I had the opportunity to go over there and work with the Good Shepherd sisters.
Oh, yes.
And I worked with 40 formerly trafficked women who shared with me their stories. So my research was qualitative, and these women shared their stories, and then I developed themes in which I really would argue that trafficking is perhaps less. What's the word? We tend to sensationalise it, and the stories that only come to the media are the most horrific, and
Yes.
it's not downplaying in any way anyone's experience, but sometimes they can be more ordinary than the sensational
I see.
shows. Yeah.
So with the Philippines and the 40 women that you talked about, were these women who'd left the Philippines but got themselves back there?
No, actually, that's a good question. I should have said, so these women were trafficked within the Philippines.
Oh, I see.
So we talk about displaced people within their own countries.
Yes.
And in actual fact, there are more, it appears to be that there are more women trafficked internally in their own country than externally, yet we tend to get the impression that
That's what I would
trafficking
have
is
had.
international.
Yeah.
And it is to that degree. And then there's also these particular women were trafficked for the purpose of prostitution. And
Yes.
so people from different countries such as Australia were going there to use the women in that capacity. So I guess you could say, it is international in that sense, yeah.
So we're talking to Sister Angela Reid from the Sisters of Mercy. We're talking about human trafficking at the moment. She's about to take on a massively interesting task at the United Nations, which we'll get to in just a moment. One last question around the trafficking, and I'm sure it'll probably come up again as we look at what you're about to do. With the trafficking, two-part question. Is it an international problem? And is it something that is happening way beyond what the average person might actually have thought?
It's definitely an international problem.
Now, when I say international, I don't mean beyond Australia. I mean, is it all over the world?
Yes, it's a global reality. I don't think you could say we can't solve the issue of human trafficking unless we address it from a global perspective.
Right.
Because it's to do with the movement of people, it's to do with globalisation, economics, migration, gender. Like it's all of those things within a global context.
Right.
So it is definitely an issue, an international issue. In terms of people's understanding, like I said, I think there's some perhaps there's a greater need to perhaps funnel down a little bit and have a look at, like, people talk about trafficking as if it's one thing, and yet human trafficking is expressed in so many different ways.
Right.
The area that I've particularly focused on has been women who are prostituted. So they're exploited for the purpose of sexual exploitation. They're trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. But people are trafficked for sweatshop labour, organ, the removal of organs. There's the whole fishing industry where people, particularly in Southeast Asia, have been trafficked onto boats and just put in debt bondage and pretty much trapped. So there's so many expressions of it. We tend to use trafficking in too broad a sense, I think. And so we need to kind of funnel down a bit and really understand. I mean, there's the international definition, but people use the term very loosely.
Yes, I can see that. And that's a good explanation.
Yeah.
Let's move on to your last 12 to 15 months where you've been working overseas.
Yes.
Tell us about that, how you got into it, and
Okay.
then your new role as the Global Action Coordinator for the United Nations for Mercy International.
Right. So in the past 12 months, I've been a resident at our office in New York, where the Sisters of Mercy work not for the UN, but we have what we call consultative status with the Economic and Social Council at the UN.
Yep.
And that gives us the capacity to be part of meetings, to give input, to make what we call oral interventions and written interventions, to take part in commissions.
Right.
And so I went as a resident in my capacity as an expert in trafficking. I'd done my doctorate, completed it in 2014 on, as I said, human trafficking. And so I was able to bring those stories to forums within the United Nations. I was able to run some workshops, to participate in coalitions that were addressing the issue of trafficking, to make some significant interventions, one in the General Assembly at what we call a high-level meeting, and also at the Human Rights Council in Geneva.
Wow.
And so at that time we had very minimal time to make an intervention. So what you say in that time is critical.
How long do you get to talk for?
You get 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
And so it takes a lot of planning, and you've got to really,
Hit home your point.
You absolutely do.
Yeah.
And it's an art, and it's something I'm learning.
Right.
I wouldn't say that I have it down pat, but it's something I'm learning, and it requires a lot of diplomacy. We need to work with lots of coalitions. We need to work with politicians, government representatives, obviously, and it requires a lot of research, and I guess the main drive for me is the relationship between human rights and our gospel,
Yes.
and our call to mercy.
And so as you interact with people from all over the world,
Right.
often not really part of what we would see as our faith,
Right.
is that highly challenging?
To be honest, it hasn't. I haven't found that to be a what would you call a barrier.
Right.
There are a lot of faith-based organisations that work that also have consultative status at the
Yes.
United Nations.
Yes.
But like we are not particularly. We're not saying it has to be faith-based organisations. If we're talking about the human dignity, the person's human dignity, if we're looking at issues of people being held against their will and so on, these are universal human rights,
Yes.
and we can join with others, so many other organisations, in terms of that. The other issue that we really strongly campaign on is the issue of water and the human right to water and sanitation.
Oh, yes.
And so there are many organisations that are not necessarily faith-based organisations that are also arguing for the human right to water and sanitation.
So you're going to be Global Action Coordinator
I am.
in the next few weeks. You start.
Yes, so March 1st I'm...
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
If you could now look into a crystal ball and say, when I finish in 2, 4, 5 years, whatever it is, I would like to have achieved 1 or 2 or 3 things, what would be your priorities? Because I'm sure these things aren't just click your fingers and we're going to get some real results quickly.
No. Well, the Sisters of Mercy have chosen to be there because we believe that our presence matters. We believe that we have the capacity to make a difference, that we come from our grassroots works and we bring a very clear message about the human dignity of each person. So I'd like to be able to say that after the time that I'm there, that Sisters of Mercy continue to be represented well, that we can look at issues that challenge perhaps the dominant economic
Yes.
and global reality of our times, which is very much progress and based on different set of values than perhaps we'd like them
Often
to
at
be.
the expense of human dignity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if we can concentrate with our issues, whatever they may be, always at the heart of it is our gospel mission,
Yes.
is the human dignity of the person, and mercy. Of course, for us, mercy is core.
We were only discussing today what a wonderful 12 months was the Year of Mercy.
Right.
I think it had a real impact, certainly here in Australia.
Absolutely. And worldwide, we as Sisters of Mercy, along with the Year of Mercy proclaimed by the Pope, we also had our own Mercy International Reflection process,
Excellent.
which we're hoping will feed into our issues at the United Nations.
Well, Sister Angela Reid from the Sisters of Mercy will be taking on this fantastic role, a very, very responsible role, as Global Action Coordinator at the United Nations in just a few weeks' time. Now, if you are watching Melbourne Catholic regularly, our lovely website, you're also going to see Sister Angela's brother, Father Brendan from Deep Dean and Baldwin, featuring in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we do an overview of the parishes that he runs in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. So it's a real Reid empire over the next few weeks.
I'll just let you know he's my older brother.
Older brother. I'm sure he'll be very happy to hear that. Sister Angela, good luck and thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.